This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. The quiet Aceh I couldn't name. I want to start with a confession that still feels uncomfortable to say out loud. Nothing in my life was falling apart. No one had left me. No diagnosis. No dramatic collapse. And yet, something inside me had already gone quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, it feels vacant. If you had looked at my life from the outside, you would have seen stability. A woman who shows up, who handles her responsibilities, who keeps things moving. I paid my bills on time. I answered emails. I remembered birthdays. I did what needed to be done. I smiled when appropriate. I listened when people talked. I was doing fine. But at night, especially at night, there was this moment. Always the same moment. The house would finally be still. The noise of the day would fade. And I would find myself standing alone in the kitchen, lights low, opening a cabinet or the refrigerator without really deciding to. Not because I was hungry, because I didn't know what else to do with the feeling that arrived when everything stopped. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anxiety. It wasn't even loneliness in the way we usually describe it. It was more like a hollow pause, a gap between one obligation and the next, a space where I suddenly had to be with myself. I didn't know how, so I ate, quietly, automatically, without ceremony. I didn't binge. I didn't spiral. I didn't lose control in any obvious way. That's what made it so easy to ignore. This wasn't the kind of problem that raises alarms. It was the kind that slips under the radar, even your own. I told myself it was normal. Everyone snacks at night. Everyone unwinds with food. Everyone deserves a little comfort after a long day. And maybe that's true. But what I wasn't willing to admit was this. Food had become the only place where I let myself stop pretending I was okay. That's the part no one really talks about. Because women like us aren't supposed to be struggling. We're supposed to be grateful, capable, self-sufficient. We've already survived the hard things. We've already proven we can handle life. So when something feels off, but not wrong enough, we swallow it. We tell ourselves we're being dramatic, or ungrateful, or weak. So instead of asking what we need, we reach for something familiar, something immediate, something that asks nothing of us in return. Food doesn't ask questions. Food doesn't require vulnerability. Food doesn't need us to explain ourselves. It just fills the space temporarily, and that temporary relief can look a lot like peace if you're tired enough. I didn't know I was emotionally eating. I wouldn't have used that phrase. I thought emotional eating meant crying into ice cream after a breakup. What I was doing felt much more subtle than that. What I was doing was disappearing in small, socially acceptable ways. And because my life looked fine, no one, including me, thought to question it. That's what made it so dangerous. Because the real cost wasn't weight or health or willpower. The real cost was that I was slowly losing touch with myself. I wasn't asking how I felt anymore. I wasn't noticing when I was overwhelmed or disconnected or empty. I just smoothed it over, night after night, bite after bite, until one evening, standing there in the quiet, it hit me with an almost physical force. This isn't about food. This is about something I've been avoiding for a long time. That realization didn't come with answers. It came with discomfort, with fear, with the unsettling sense that if I stopped numbing, I might have to listen, really listen to what had been trying to get my attention. and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. But here's what I've learned since then, and why I'm telling you this now. If any part of you recognizes yourself in this, if you're functioning, capable, outwardly fine, but quietly disconnected, you are not failing at life. You are not broken. You are standing in the middle of something that doesn't have a name yet. And that middle deserves to be explored, not ignored. If this kind of quiet honesty matters to you, if you want conversations that don't shout solutions or sell transformations, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Your support is what allows me to keep creating spaces like this, where we don't rush to fix ourselves, but finally slow down enough to understand what's really going on beneath the surface. This is just the beginning. When fixing my eating didn't fix anything. For a long time, I was convinced that the problem lived on my plate. If I could just eat better, everything else would fall into place. That was the promise I quietly believed, even when I pretended not to. It felt logical, safe, tangible. Food was something I could measure, control, and correct. Feelings were not. So I did what responsible, reasonable women are taught to do when something feels off. I tried to fix it. I didn't announce it. I didn't make a big declaration. I simply started tightening the rules. I paid closer attention. I made mental lists of foods that were good and foods that needed to be handled carefully, sparingly, or ideally not at all. I told myself this wasn't a diet, just being mindful, just being healthier, just being more intentional. But underneath those calm explanations was a quiet urgency, a belief that if I could just get my eating under control, I would finally feel settled inside my own life. At first, it felt productive, reassuring even. There's a particular comfort in having a plan, in believing that the solution is procedural. Eat this, not that. Stay within the lines. Don't overthink it. Except I was overthinking it constantly. Food began to take up more mental space, not less. I found myself calculating, negotiating, anticipating what I had eaten earlier, what I would allow myself later, how I would make up for something if I crossed an invisible line I had drawn for myself. And when I inevitably did, because rules around food are rarely neutral, something familiar crept in. Disappointment, self-criticism, that low, heavy feeling of having failed at something I was supposed to be able to handle by now. I didn't see it clearly then, but I was putting myself in a quiet war, not just with food, but with my own body. I was treating hunger like a problem to be managed, appetite like a flaw to be corrected, and satisfaction like something I had to earn. The irony is that the harder I tried to control my eating, the more chaotic it felt. I would have days where I followed every rule I had set for myself. Those days were labeled successful. I felt virtuous, calm even. But the calm was brittle. It depended entirely on staying inside the lines. And then there were the other days. Days when I ate past fullness. Days when I reached for food automatically, almost resentfully. Days when the rules collapsed under the weight of exhaustion or stress or something I couldn't quite name. Those were the days that haunted me, not because of the food itself, but because of what it seemed to say about me. Why can't I be consistent? Why do I keep undoing my own effort? What kind of grown woman still struggles with this? I didn't talk about it with anyone. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. I wasn't losing control in a way that alarmed people. I was functioning. I was coping. I was still doing fine. That's what made it so isolating. Because when you don't fit the stereotype of someone who's struggling, you don't feel entitled to struggle. So I internalized it. I assumed the issue was discipline, motivation, some missing piece of willpower that other people seemed to have figured out. What I didn't understand yet was that I was asking food to do something it was never meant to do, regulate my emotional world. I was trying to fix a sense of inner disconnection with external control. And control, it turns out, is a very fragile substitute for understanding. The more I tried to manage my eating, the more disconnected I felt from my body's natural signals. Hunger and fullness became secondary to rules. Cravings became suspicious. Pleasure became something to monitor. I stopped trusting myself. And when you stop trusting yourself, every choice feels loaded. Every meal becomes a test. Every deviation feels like proof that something is fundamentally wrong with you. Looking back, I can see how much energy that took. How exhausting it was to live in constant self-surveillance. To be both the one setting the rules and the one breaking them. But at the time, I thought this was just part of being an adult woman, that managing food was supposed to be hard, that peace around eating was reserved for people who had better bodies, better habits, better self-control. I didn't know another way. What finally began to crack that belief wasn't a new plan or a better strategy. It was a growing suspicion that my focus was misplaced. Because no matter how carefully I ate, the underlying restlessness didn't go away. The quiet pull toward food in moments of transition, fatigue, or emptiness remained. Sometimes it even intensified, as if my body were pushing back against being ignored. I started to notice something unsettling. The days I ate perfectly were often the days I felt the most detached, numb, disconnected from myself, as if I were performing wellness rather than living it. And the days I broke my rules weren't random. They followed patterns, long meetings, unspoken resentment, evenings that felt too quiet, moments when I didn't know what to do with myself. For the first time, it occurred to me that my eating wasn't chaotic at all. It was responsive. It was answering something I hadn't been willing to hear. Trying to fix my eating hadn't failed because I didn't try hard enough. It failed because it was never the real problem to begin with. I was adjusting the surface while ignoring what was moving underneath. And until I was willing to look there, not to judge, not to correct, but simply to understand, no amount of control was going to bring the peace I was quietly searching for. The moment I stopped asking, "What am I eating?" the moment things began to shift didn't look like change. There was no decision, no promise, no clean break from the way I had been living. If anything, it felt almost disappointingly small, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. I was doing what I always did, ending a day that had taken more out of me than I'd expected, moving through my kitchen on autopilot, reaching for food with the kind of familiarity that comes from repetition, not desire. But something in me hesitated, not enough to stop, just enough to notice. And instead of asking the question I had trained myself to ask, "What am I eating? How much? Is this okay?" another question surfaced. Quiet, unimpressive, almost intrusive. Why am I eating this? I didn't ask it with discipline in mind. I wasn't trying to talk myself out of anything. There was no plan behind it. It wasn't a strategy. It was curiosity. That alone felt foreign. For so long, my relationship with food had been governed by judgment, right or wrong, allowed or not, better or worse. Every bite carried an evaluation. I was either doing well or falling short. This question didn't fit into that framework. Why am I eating this right now? I stood there longer than was comfortable, holding that question without rushing to answer it. And what surprised me wasn't the clarity that followed, but the discomfort. Because once I stopped focusing on the food, there was nothing left to distract me from what was actually happening inside my body. I wasn't hungry. That was clear almost immediately. What I felt instead was something harder to pin down, a kind of internal buzzing, not anxiety exactly, not sadness, more like a low-grade restlessness, as if something in me was unsettled and didn't know where to land. It was the feeling I'd been avoiding for years, not consciously, not dramatically, but through small, efficient acts of distraction. Food had been one of them. Asking that question forced me to stay present with a sensation I didn't have language for yet. And in that moment, I understood why I had spent so much time focusing on what I ate. Because why was messier. The why didn't come with instructions. It didn't offer a solution. It didn't tell me what to do next. It just asked me to notice. And noticing, it turns out, is not neutral. Once you notice, you can't unknow. I started asking the question more often, not every time, not perfectly, not with any sense of discipline, just enough to begin seeing patterns. Why now? Why this moment? Why after certain kinds of days? The answers were rarely dramatic. I wasn't uncovering buried trauma or repressed memories. What I found instead were small, overlooked emotional states that had never felt important enough to acknowledge. I was eating when the day ended, and I didn't know how to transition into evening. I was eating when I felt oddly untethered after a long stretch of focus. I was eating when I felt unmotivated, unengaged, vaguely dissatisfied in a way that didn't justify complaint. These weren't emergencies, they were quiet signals. And I had been muting them for so long that I'd forgotten they were trying to communicate at all. What changed wasn't my behavior right away. I still ate when I wasn't hungry. I still reached for food automatically. But something subtle shifted in how I experienced those moments. Instead of rushing past them, I lingered. I let myself feel the agitation without immediately trying to fix it. I noticed the emptiness without labeling it as a problem. I paid attention to the way my body tightened or softened depending on what was happening internally. Sometimes, just naming the feeling was enough to dull its edge. Not eliminate it, not solve it, just soften it. I realized that emotions, even the vague, uncomfortable ones, don't actually ask for solutions right away. Most of the time, they just want recognition. That was a revelation. I had spent years assuming that if I couldn't resolve a feeling, it meant I was failing at something. That discomfort was evidence of incompetence. That not knowing what I needed meant I was behind. But standing there, asking why instead of what, I began to understand that confusion wasn't a flaw. It was information. And the reason this question mattered so much wasn't because it stopped me from eating. It often didn't. It mattered because it shifted my attention from control to awareness, from behavior to experience, from fixing to listening. For the first time, food stopped being the main event. It became contextual. a response, not a moral test, a signal, not a verdict. I started to see how much pressure I had been putting on myself to manage life efficiently, quietly, without mess. How little room I'd allowed for uncertainty, ambivalence, or emotional nuance. Asking why didn't make my life easier, but it made it more honest. And honesty, I was learning, is far less exhausting than constant self-correction. There was grief in that realization. Grief for how long I had overridden myself. Grief for how quickly I had reached for something external instead of staying with my own internal world. But there was also relief. Because if my eating wasn't the problem, if it was just the symptom, then maybe I wasn't as broken as I'd believed. Maybe nothing needed to be fixed yet. Maybe something needed to be understood. That question, why am I eating this, didn't change my life overnight. It didn't come with a tidy before and after story. What it did was open a door I had kept closed out of habit. And once that door cracked open, there was no going back to pretending that food was the whole story. It never was. It was just the place where everything I hadn't been listening to finally gathered, waiting for me to notice. Emotional hunger isn't loud. That's why I missed it. I missed emotional hunger for so long because I thought hunger was supposed to be obvious. I believed it would arrive with urgency, with pain, with a clear sense of lack. I assumed that if something inside me truly needed attention, it would demand it loudly enough that I couldn't ignore it. But emotional hunger doesn't work that way. It doesn't knock. It doesn't interrupt. It waits. It slips into the background of a life that looks functional. It settles into routines. It hides behind competence and reliability. And if you're the kind of woman who knows how to keep going, who knows how to be useful, steady, dependable, it's easy to live with it for years without ever realizing what it is. That was me. I didn't wake up feeling empty. I didn't move through my days in pain. I felt neutral, slightly dulled, as if life had been turned down just enough that I couldn't hear myself clearly anymore. Emotional hunger didn't feel like wanting something specific. It felt like the absence of wanting altogether. I wasn't craving more success or a different life. I wasn't longing for dramatic change. I wasn't dissatisfied in a way that justified complaint. What I felt instead was a quiet thinning, a subtle erosion of presence. I went through the motions of my life with efficiency. I handled what needed to be handled. I met expectations. I stayed busy enough that there was rarely space to notice what wasn't there. That's why I missed it. Because emotional hunger doesn't show up as a problem, it shows up as a dullness you learn to live with. It's the feeling of moving from one task to the next without any real sense of arrival, of finishing a day and not knowing what it gave you, of being technically engaged but emotionally untouched. It's not despair, it's disconnection. And disconnection is easy to rationalize. I told myself this was adulthood. That passion fades, that life settles, that this was the trade-off for stability. I believed that wanting more presence, more depth, more aliveness was unrealistic, maybe even indulgent. So I adapted. I learned how to function without asking myself how I felt. I learned how to fill my days with enough noise that the quiet didn't feel threatening. And when the quiet did arrive late at night, in transitions, in moments where I had nothing to distract me, I reached for food. Not because I was starving, because food created sensation. It grounded me. It gave shape to time. It offered a beginning, a middle, and an end, when everything else felt vaguely unfinished. Emotional hunger is not about appetite. It's about orientation. It's what happens when you lose a sense of where you are in your own life. I didn't know how long I'd been operating that way until I started paying attention. Once I did, I saw it everywhere. In the way I avoided unstructured time. In how uncomfortable I felt when nothing was expected of me. In how quickly I reached for something external when I felt vaguely off. Emotional hunger wasn't asking to be filled. It was asking to be noticed. That realization changed how I understood myself. It reframed years of behavior I had previously labeled as weakness or lack of discipline. I wasn't failing to manage my eating. I was compensating for a lack of emotional nourishment. And emotional nourishment doesn't come from intensity or drama. It comes from being present with your own internal life, something many women are never taught to do. We're taught to be responsive, not reflective, to manage outcomes, not experiences, to stay composed, to stay useful. Over time, that training takes a toll. You stop checking in with yourself because nothing feels urgent enough to justify it. You stop asking what you need because you've learned to survive without asking. You stop trusting subtle signals because they don't seem practical. Emotional hunger thrives in that environment. It doesn't demand more, it quietly accepts less. And that's why it's so dangerous. Because by the time you notice it, you've often built a life around not feeling too much. When I finally recognized what was happening, it wasn't dramatic, it was sobering. I realized that I had been living slightly to the side of my own experience. That I was present enough to function, but not present enough to feel engaged. That food had become one of the few ways I reliably returned to my body. This wasn't a failure of character. It was the predictable outcome of years spent prioritizing external stability over internal connection. Emotional hunger doesn't ask for indulgence. It asks for attention. It asks you to slow down enough to feel what you've been bypassing, to acknowledge the quiet dissatisfaction without immediately fixing it, to recognize that numbness is a signal, not a verdict. Once I saw emotional hunger clearly, I understood why no amount of behavioral change had worked before. You can't solve a lack of emotional presence with rules. You can't fix disconnection with control. And you can't out-discipline a need that hasn't been named. Emotional hunger isn't loud because it doesn't need to be. It knows we're skilled at ignoring ourselves. It waits patiently, filling the spaces we leave unattended. Food was never the cause. It was just where the hunger went when I didn't know how to listen. Understanding that didn't make the hunger disappear, but it gave it context. And context, I was learning, is the beginning of compassion, not just toward my eating, but toward the parts of myself that had been quietly asking for something more human all along. The small feelings that drove me to food. What finally surprised me wasn't that I turned to food when I was sad or overwhelmed. It was how often I turned to food when nothing was obviously wrong. I had always assumed emotional eating came from big feelings, heartbreak, grief, panic, despair. The kinds of emotions that justify collapse. The kinds people understand. But what drove me to food most consistently were feelings so small and ordinary that I barely considered them emotions at all. They didn't feel important enough to name. They felt like background conditions, like the emotional equivalent of low lighting or static in the air, easy to ignore, easy to normalize. And because they were easy to dismiss, they quietly shaped my behavior. One of the strongest was boredom, though even that word doesn't quite capture it. It wasn't the boredom of having nothing to do. My days were full. Meetings, errands, responsibilities, messages. I was occupied from morning to night. This was a deeper boredom, a lack of engagement, a sense that I was moving through tasks without any real sense of involvement. When that feeling surfaced, food offered stimulation, texture, flavor, contrast, something happening in a day that otherwise felt flat, crunchy foods especially. Things that made noise, things that gave my nervous system something to register. I didn't know I was doing that. I just knew that eating made the moment feel less empty. Another feeling that drove me to food was loneliness, but not the kind that announces itself as loneliness. I wasn't isolated. I interacted with people regularly. I had conversations. I showed up socially when needed. But there's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from not being emotionally met, from not being seen in a way that feels real, from being surrounded by people and still feeling fundamentally on your own. Food created a sense of company. It filled space. It softened the edges of an evening that felt too quiet. It gave me something to do with myself when I didn't know how to reach for connection without feeling like a burden. There was also exhaustion, the kind that doesn't resolve with a good night's sleep. This was the fatigue of constant functioning, of being on for long stretches of time, of managing life without ever fully resting. When I felt that kind of tired, food felt like relief, a shortcut to energy, a brief escape from the weight of responsibility. I reached for sweetness, not because I wanted dessert, but because my system was depleted and didn't know how else to recover. Sometimes the feeling was emptiness, not sadness, not grief, just a hollow sense that something was missing, without knowing what it was. That feeling was the hardest to sit with. It felt vaguely threatening, even though nothing bad was happening. Food made it less noticeable. It gave the illusion of fullness, not just in my body, but in the moment itself. I also ate when I felt mildly irritated, not angry enough to confront anyone, not upset enough to justify a reaction. Just irritated enough to feel uncomfortable in my own skin. Food helped me swallow that irritation. It smoothed it over. It gave me something else to focus on besides the fact that I was carrying feelings I didn't feel entitled to express. What all of these emotions had in common wasn't intensity. It was subtlety. They were easy to overlook, easy to minimize, easy to explain away. And because I didn't acknowledge them, they accumulated. Food became the release valve, not because I lacked awareness or strength, but because my emotional world had no other outlet. One of the most important realizations for me was understanding that these small feelings weren't signs of dysfunction. They were signals. They were telling me about unmet needs I had never learned how to address directly. Boredom was pointing to a lack of meaning or novelty. Loneliness was pointing to a need for connection that felt safe. Exhaustion was pointing to boundaries I wasn't setting. Emptiness was pointing to parts of myself I had stopped listening to. I didn't see that at first. All I saw was the behavior, the eating, and I judged myself for it. Why can't I just stop? Why do I always do this at night? Why is food such a thing for me? Those questions kept me focused on the surface. What changed was learning to look underneath without assuming something was wrong. When I began to notice these small feelings as they arose, something unexpected happened. They lost some of their power, not because they disappeared, but because they no longer had to shout to be heard. I started to see how quickly I reached for food at the first hint of discomfort, how little tolerance I had for emotional ambiguity, how fast I tried to fill any space that didn't feel immediately satisfying. This wasn't a character flaw, it was conditioning. I had learned, like many women, to prioritize smoothness, to avoid friction, to keep things moving, to not linger too long in states that felt unproductive or inconvenient. Small feelings disrupt that efficiency. They slow you down. They ask questions without offering answers. They don't resolve neatly. Food was my way of restoring order, of closing the loop, of making the moment feel complete. Once I understood that, I stopped seeing my eating as impulsive or irrational. It was purposeful. It was responsive. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do in the absence of emotional awareness. This realization didn't mean I stopped eating for emotional reasons overnight. What it did mean was that I stopped being confused by it. Instead of reacting with frustration, I began to respond with curiosity. What just happened? What did I feel right before this? What was I trying not to feel? Sometimes I still chose to eat, but the choice felt different when it was informed. Because once you recognize the small feelings driving your behavior, you can't unsee them. And once they're seen, they don't need to hide behind food anymore. They can simply exist quietly, honestly, asking for attention instead of relief. What judging my feelings was really costing me. For a long time, I believed the hardest part of my emotional life was the feelings themselves. The restlessness, the irritation, the envy I didn't want to admit, the quiet resentment that surfaced when I was tired or overlooked. I thought those feelings were the problem. What I couldn't see, not for years, was that the real damage wasn't coming from what I felt, but from what I did after I felt it. I judged myself relentlessly, automatically, without mercy. The judgment was so fast, I barely noticed it happening. A feeling would arise, and within seconds, I would have already decided what it meant about me. If I felt angry, I told myself I was being unreasonable. If I felt jealous, I decided I was small-minded. If I felt resentful, I concluded I was ungrateful. If I felt sad without a clear reason, I assumed I was weak. There was no room for curiosity, no pause, no space to simply experience what was there. Just a swift internal verdict. You shouldn't feel this way. That verdict mattered more than I realized, because the moment I judged a feeling, I turned it into something dangerous, something that had to be managed, corrected, or hidden as quickly as possible. And that's where food came in. Not as comfort, exactly. Not even as pleasure. As escape. When I judged my feelings, I didn't just feel uncomfortable, I felt wrong. And feeling wrong is intolerable if you've built your identity around being capable, reasonable, and composed. So I reached for the one thing that reliably quieted the inner courtroom. Food didn't ask me to explain myself. It didn't question my motives. It didn't tell me who I was supposed to be. It simply interrupted the cycle. What I didn't understand at the time was how much I was layering on top of myself emotionally. A feeling would arise, maybe mild irritation after a long day. On its own, that feeling was manageable. It had a shape, a duration, a message. But the moment I judged it, I added something heavier, shame. Now I wasn't just irritated, I was ashamed of being irritated. I wasn't just tired, I was ashamed of being tired. I wasn't just lonely, I was ashamed of needing more than I had. That layering is what made my emotional life feel overwhelming. It wasn't the original emotion that knocked me off balance. It was the accumulation, and food became my way of flattening the stack. Eating didn't resolve the irritation or the loneliness or the fatigue, but it dulled the shame enough that I could function again. That's an important distinction. I wasn't using food to avoid feelings. I was using food to avoid judgment. Once I saw that, everything shifted. I began to notice how moralized my inner language was. How often I framed emotions as failures instead of experiences. How quickly I made my feelings mean something about my character. I treated emotions like evidence in a case against myself, and I realized how deeply that habit was rooted. Many of us are taught subtly, consistently, that certain emotions are acceptable and others are not. That anger should be controlled, that envy is ugly, that sadness should be brief, that needing reassurance is immature. So we don't just feel emotions, we evaluate them, we categorize them, we rank them, and in doing so, we turn our internal world into a place that doesn't feel safe. Why would any feeling want to stay where it's immediately criticized? Why wouldn't it try to hide, or come out sideways, or demand attention through behavior? When I started paying attention to my judgment, I saw how quickly it escalated everything. A small emotion became a big problem because I refused to let it exist without commentary. I thought I was being honest with myself. I thought I was holding myself accountable. What I was actually doing was abandoning myself the moment I became inconvenient. That abandonment had consequences. It taught my nervous system that feelings were threats, that discomfort was dangerous, that the safest response was numbing. Food was one of the fastest ways to numb without appearing to fall apart. No one questions eating. No one worries when you snack. It's socially acceptable, quiet, efficient, perfect for someone who doesn't want to draw attention to her inner world. The turning point didn't come when I learned to think differently about food. It came when I learned to relate differently to my emotions, specifically when I stopped treating them like problems to solve or flaws to correct. I began experimenting cautiously with letting feelings exist without commentary, not approving them, not indulging them, just allowing them. This was harder than it sounds. The impulse to judge was strong, automatic, almost reflexive. But I noticed something important. When I didn't judge a feeling, it didn't grow, it didn't spiral, it didn't consume me. It didn't demand immediate relief. It moved through me slowly, imperfectly, but predictably. And when I didn't add shame to the experience, I didn't need food to escape it. That doesn't mean the feelings were pleasant. It means they were tolerable. There's a profound difference between discomfort and danger. I had been treating them as the same thing. Judging my feelings had been costing me far more than I realized. It cost me energy. It cost me clarity. It cost me trust in myself. Most of all, it cost me intimacy with my own experience. When I stopped judging, I didn't become passive or permissive. I became present. I could say, "This is what I'm feeling," without immediately asking, What does this say about me? That single shift reduced the urgency around eating more than any rule or plan ever had. Because when emotions aren't treated like enemies, they don't require escape routes. They require attention. And attention, I was learning, is far less destructive than judgment and infinitely more honest. Food no longer had to carry the weight of my unprocessed self-criticism. It could simply be food, and my feelings could simply be feelings. Messy, human, temporary, exactly as they were always meant to be. When I stopped trying to feel better. For most of my adult life, I believed there was an unspoken rule I was supposed to follow. If I didn't feel good, I needed to fix it. Feeling better wasn't just a desire, it felt like a responsibility, a measure of competence, a quiet moral obligation. If something inside me felt heavy or flat or unsettled, I assumed I was doing something wrong by letting it stay that way. So I tried to improve my inner state the same way I managed everything else in my life. Efficiently, quietly, without disruption. I reframed. I distracted myself. I stayed busy. I told myself things could be worse. And when none of that worked, I reached for food not because I loved it, but because it reliably changed how I felt, even if only for a few minutes. What I didn't understand then was how exhausting it is to be constantly trying to feel better. It keeps you in a state of vigilance, always monitoring your internal weather, always scanning for discomfort, always bracing against the possibility that something unpleasant might arise. I wasn't living my life. I was managing my emotional output. And that management came at a cost. Because the more I tried to feel better, the less tolerant I became of feeling anything else. I treated discomfort like an error message, something to override as quickly as possible, something that threatened the image I had of myself as capable and stable. There was a particular kind of fear underneath that effort, the fear that if I didn't intervene, things would spiral, that one bad feeling would lead to another and another until I lost control. So I stayed ahead of it, or at least I tried to. But the irony was this: the more I tried to feel better, the worse I felt about feeling bad. Every low mood became evidence of failure. Every flat day felt like proof that I wasn't doing life correctly. I didn't just experience emotions, I evaluated my performance within them. Food gave me a way out of that evaluation. It didn't make me happy, but it made me feel different, and different felt safer than still. The shift came slowly, and not because I decided to stop improving myself. It came because I grew tired of fighting my own inner landscape. I noticed how much energy it took to constantly adjust myself, to lift my mood, reframe my thoughts, override my instincts. I noticed how little space there was for simply being human, and somewhere along the way, a radical idea settled in. What if nothing had gone wrong? What if feeling dull or restless or quietly dissatisfied wasn't a problem to solve, but a part of the experience I had been trying to bypass? I had internalized the belief that a good life feels good most of the time. That if I wasn't feeling positive, aligned, or motivated, I must be missing something. But that belief was making me brittle, because life isn't designed to feel good consistently. It's designed to be lived, and living includes frustration, boredom, ambivalence, grief, and long stretches of neutrality. When I stopped trying to feel better, I didn't give up on myself. I gave myself permission to stop correcting every internal fluctuation. That permission changed everything. Instead of asking, "How do I get out of this feeling?" I started asking, "Can I stay with this without making it worse?" That question didn't come with a strategy, it came with uncertainty. And uncertainty was uncomfortable, but it was also honest. I began letting feelings exist without rushing them toward resolution. I let boredom be boring. I let sadness be sad. I let heaviness move through me at its own pace. This didn't make life darker. It made it quieter. And in that quiet, I noticed something I hadn't expected. Feelings passed more easily when I didn't interfere with them. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but reliably. The urge to eat in response to discomfort softened, not because I was resisting it, but because I no longer needed food to change my state. I wasn't demanding that my inner world perform for me. I was allowing it to be real. There was grief in this stage, grief for how much time I'd spent believing I needed to be better than I was. Grief for how often I'd mistaken emotional presence for weakness. But there was also relief, because when I stopped trying to feel better, I stopped treating discomfort like danger. I learned that I could feel low without falling apart, that I could feel dissatisfied without needing to escape, that I could feel nothing in particular and still be okay. This wasn't resignation, it was acceptance. And acceptance didn't make me stagnant, it made me grounded. Food lost some of its power because I no longer needed a shortcut out of my own experience. I wasn't trying to optimize my mood. I wasn't chasing a version of myself who felt good all the time. I was learning how to stay. Stay with uncertainty. Stay with ambiguity. Stay with the parts of life that don't offer immediate payoff. That staying required trust, not in the outcome, but in my capacity to experience whatever came up without abandoning myself. And that trust grew slowly, built through moments where I felt uncomfortable and discovered that nothing terrible happened. I didn't collapse. I didn't drown. I didn't lose myself. I lived through it. Stopping the constant effort to feel better didn't make me less engaged with my life. It made me more honest about it. And honesty, I was learning, is far more sustaining than positivity. Because a life that allows for discomfort has room for depth, and depth doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be felt. Learning to feel without falling apart. For a long time, the reason I avoided my feelings wasn't because I didn't understand them. It was because I didn't trust myself to survive them. There was a quiet fear underneath everything, not dramatic, not conscious, but persistent. A belief that if I truly let myself feel what was there, something would break, that the floor would give way, that I would open a door I wouldn't know how to close. So I kept my emotions at a distance. I allowed them in theory. I acknowledged them in passing. But I never stayed long enough to find out what they actually wanted. What I told myself was that I was being practical, strong, functional. I had responsibilities, a life that required consistency. I didn't have the luxury of unraveling. What I didn't realize was that I was confusing feeling with falling apart as if the two were the same thing. They weren't. But when you've spent years managing yourself tightly, any loosening feels dangerous. The first time I truly tried to stay with a feeling, I expected intensity. I braced myself for something overwhelming, a wave of despair, a flood of grief, a collapse I wouldn't be able to contain. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter, stranger, almost disappointing. The feeling showed up as a sensation before it became a story. A tightness in my chest, a heaviness behind my eyes, a subtle pressure I usually rushed past when I didn't judge it, didn't analyze it, didn't try to shift it. It didn't escalate. It moved slowly, imperfectly, but predictably. That was the first crack in the belief I'd been living under, the belief that feelings are inherently unmanageable. They aren't. What makes them unbearable is resistance. For years, I had been meeting emotions with urgency. The urgency to fix, suppress, reframe, or escape. That urgency taught my nervous system that emotions were threats. And when something is perceived as a threat, the body looks for relief. Food had been one of the fastest ways to create that relief. Not because emotions were too much, but because I had never learned how to feel them safely. Safety turned out to be the missing piece. Not safety in the sense of perfect conditions or calm surroundings, but safety in my relationship with myself. I began to understand that what scared me wasn't the feelings themselves, but what I believed they meant. If I felt despair, I believed I was despair. If I felt overwhelmed, I believed I couldn't cope. If I felt small, I believed that was the truth about me. There was no separation between experience and identity. So every emotion felt final. Learning to feel without falling apart required me to change that relationship. I started speaking to myself differently, not kindly, in a forced way. Not with affirmations, but with realism. Instead of saying, "This is who I am," I said, "A part of me feels this right now." That sentence created space. It reminded me that emotions are states, not definitions, that they pass through me, not claim ownership of me. It sounds subtle, but the effect was profound. Once I stopped identifying completely with every feeling, the fear around them softened. They no longer felt like verdicts. They felt like visitors, unwelcome sometimes, uncomfortable often, but temporary. Another thing I learned was that feeling doesn't mean drowning. I had imagined emotions as something that would pull me under if I let go. What I discovered instead was that they behave more like waves. They rise, crest, and fall whether I fight them or not. Fighting just makes the water rougher. I also learned that my body needed reassurance, not arguments. When I felt overwhelmed, telling myself to calm down didn't help. Explaining why everything was fine didn't help. Trying to reason my way out of a sensation didn't help. What helped was grounding. Simple, unremarkable things. Feeling my feet on the floor, noticing my breath without changing it, stepping outside and letting the air register on my skin. These weren't techniques meant to erase emotion. They were ways of reminding my body that I was here and that here was safe enough. As I practiced this, something unexpected happened. The backlog of unprocessed emotions surfaced. There were days when everything felt more intense than before, more raw, more present, as if years of avoidance were finally asking for attention. That stage was uncomfortable, but it was also honest. I had mistaken numbness for stability. What I was experiencing now wasn't instability, it was reawakening. And because I wasn't judging myself for it, it didn't spiral. I let feelings come and go without asking them to justify themselves. I didn't interrogate them for meaning right away. I trusted that clarity would come later. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. Either way, I survived. That survival built trust. Trust that I could feel deeply without disintegrating. Trust that discomfort didn't require immediate relief. Trust that I didn't need to abandon myself to get through hard moments. Food gradually lost its role as emotional armor. Not because I banned it, but because I no longer needed it to protect me from my own inner world. I was learning how to stay present with myself, not heroically, not gracefully, but honestly. Learning to feel without falling apart didn't make me fearless. It made me grounded. I still experience emotions that unsettle me. I still have days where things feel heavy or unclear. The difference is that I no longer treat those moments as emergencies. I know now that I can feel them and remain intact. That knowledge changed everything, because when you trust yourself to feel, you don't need to numb. You don't need to escape. You don't need to disappear into something else to survive your own life. You can stay. And staying, I've learned, is the most radical form of self-respect there is. Making peace with food. Making peace with food didn't happen when I finally found the right way to eat. It happened when I stopped needing food to play a role it was never meant to play. For a long time, food had been cast as the villain in my story. It was the thing I had to manage, monitor, control. When I felt out of balance, food was the first suspect. When I felt ashamed, food was the evidence. When I wanted to explain my discomfort without going too deep, food gave me a convenient explanation. If I could just eat differently, I told myself, everything would settle. But once I began to understand my emotional world more clearly, that story started to fall apart. Because food hadn't been sabotaging me. It had been helping me survive. That realization was uncomfortable at first. It challenged years of internal blame. It asked me to reconsider behaviors I had labeled as failures and look at them as adaptations. Food had given me relief when I didn't feel safe feeling. It had grounded me when I felt disconnected from my body. It had softened moments that felt too sharp or too empty to sit with. It wasn't the enemy. It was a tool I leaned on when I didn't have others. Seeing food this way didn't mean romanticizing it or pretending it solved anything. It meant acknowledging its role honestly, without moralizing it. For the first time, I stopped asking food to carry my shame. I stopped telling myself stories about being weak or undisciplined. I stopped framing my eating as evidence of personal failure. I stopped turning meals into verdicts. Instead, I looked at my relationship with food as a conversation that had gone on too long without clarity. Food had been responding to my nervous system, not my appetite alone. It had been meeting needs I didn't know how to articulate. It had been filling spaces I didn't yet know how to inhabit. When I understood that, the urgency around food softened. Not immediately, not perfectly, but steadily. The less I fought food, the less power it had. This was one of the most surprising parts of the process. I had assumed that loosening control would lead to chaos, that giving myself permission would open the floodgates, that if I stopped monitoring myself, everything would spiral. It didn't. What spirals is deprivation, not freedom. When I stopped assigning moral weight to food, my choices became simpler. Not because I was suddenly enlightened, but because I wasn't negotiating with myself all the time. I wasn't eating to rebel anymore. I wasn't eating to prove anything. I was just eating. And that simplicity changed how food felt in my body. I began to notice hunger again, not the frantic kind that comes after restriction, but the quiet, steady kind that asks to be met. I noticed fullness too, not as a rule, but as information. I noticed when food tasted good and when it didn't, when I wanted more and when I didn't, when eating felt nourishing and when it felt like a distraction. These signals had always been there. I just hadn't trusted them. Making peace with food also meant letting go of the idea that eating should always be purposeful, that every bite needed to serve health, productivity, or optimization. Sometimes eating was just eating. Sometimes it was pleasure. Sometimes it was tradition. Sometimes it was comfort. And that was okay. I had spent years trying to justify my eating to make it reasonable, defensible, unimpeachable. But the truth is, eating is a human act, not a performance. When I allowed that, food stopped being charged with meaning. It became neutral, and neutrality is incredibly freeing. I could eat something comforting without needing to explain it to myself. I could enjoy a meal without scanning for consequences. I could notice when I was using food to cope without immediately turning that awareness into punishment. That last part mattered more than anything, because making peace with food didn't mean I never ate emotionally again. It meant that when I did, I stayed present. I didn't disappear into the experience. I didn't check out. I didn't add shame afterward. I noticed what was happening. I acknowledged the need underneath. I allowed the moment to be what it was without turning it into a narrative about who I was. That presence changed the texture of my relationship with food. It slowed things down. It introduced choice where there had only been impulse. And slowly, food stopped being the primary place where my unmet needs landed. Not because I forbade it, but because I expanded my capacity to meet myself elsewhere. I began to see how deeply diet culture had shaped my thinking, how it had taught me to distrust my body and outsource authority, how it had framed control as virtue and ease as indulgence. Letting go of that mindset felt like stepping out of a room I hadn't realized I was locked inside. There was grief there. Grief for the years I spent policing myself. Grief for the peace I thought I had to earn. But there was also relief, because peace with food wasn't something I had to achieve. It was something that emerged naturally once I stopped fighting. Food no longer needed to be my regulator, my reward, my escape, or my punishment. It could just be food, and I could just be human. That shift didn't make my life perfect. It didn't eliminate discomfort or complexity, but it returned something essential to me: trust. Trust in my body's signals. Trust in my ability to respond to myself honestly. Trust that I didn't need to be controlled to be okay. Making peace with food wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment the story stopped revolving around food at all. And that was the quiet freedom I had been searching for long before I knew how to name it. Emotional problems need emotional solutions. What I began to understand, slowly and without fanfare, was this. I had been trying to solve emotional problems with non-emotional tools for most of my life. I treated discomfort like a logistical issue, something to manage efficiently, something that needed an external fix. If I felt restless, I looked for stimulation. If I felt lonely, I filled the space. If I felt overwhelmed, I pushed harder. If I felt empty, I numbed. Food had been the most convenient version of that strategy. But it wasn't the only one. Busyness, productivity, noise, even self-care. At times, all of them were ways of avoiding the same thing, actually responding to what I was feeling. What changed wasn't that I stopped eating for emotional reasons. It was that I stopped pretending emotions could be handled indirectly. Because emotions don't dissolve when they're bypassed. They reroute. And they rerouted through my behavior. Once I stopped framing my eating as the central issue, a clearer pattern emerged. Every time I reached for food without hunger, there was an emotional question I hadn't answered. Not a dramatic question, not a philosophical one, a simple one. What do I need right now emotionally? That question felt almost naive at first, too soft, too impractical. I was used to concrete answers, tangible solutions, things I could execute. But emotional needs don't respond to execution. They respond to presence. When I was bored, food gave me stimulation, but boredom itself was asking for engagement. Something meaningful, something that made me feel involved rather than entertained. When I was lonely, food gave me company, but loneliness was asking for connection that carried risk. A voice, a reach, a moment of being seen. When I was exhausted, food gave me a burst of energy, but exhaustion was asking for rest, or boundaries, or permission to stop performing. When I was empty, food gave me fullness, but emptiness was asking for attention, for depth, for reconnection with parts of myself I had set aside. None of these needs were unreasonable. I just hadn't learned how to meet them directly. Emotional solutions are slower than behavioral ones. They don't deliver immediate relief. They often involve uncertainty, vulnerability, or discomfort, which is exactly why I avoided them. Eating was faster, cleaner, less exposed, but it was also temporary. What surprised me was that addressing emotions emotionally didn't require grand gestures. It didn't mean overhauling my life or confronting everything at once. It meant small, honest responses. If I felt bored, I didn't need to redesign my existence. Sometimes I needed to do something that engaged me, not productively, not impressively, but genuinely. If I felt lonely, I didn't need to be surrounded by people. I needed one moment of real connection, even if it felt awkward to initiate. If I felt tired, I didn't need more discipline. I needed rest, the kind that doesn't come with guilt. If I felt sad, I didn't need to talk myself out of it. I needed to let it exist without turning it into a problem. These responses weren't efficient. They were human. And because they were human, they worked in a way food never could. Not instantly, but sustainably. I also had to accept something uncomfortable. Emotional solutions don't always feel good at first. Reaching out when you're lonely risks rejection. Resting when you're tired confronts you with how depleted you really are. Sitting with sadness forces you to feel what you've been avoiding. Food had spared me from those confrontations. Letting go of it as my primary regulator meant stepping into experiences that felt less controlled. But those experiences didn't break me. They grounded me. One of the most important shifts was learning to design my days with my emotional life in mind, not as an afterthought, but as a consideration. I stopped treating evenings as something to get through. I began asking what kind of transition I needed after a day of output. Silence, movement, a change of scenery, not stimulation, restoration. I noticed how often my urge to eat appeared in moments of emotional ambiguity, the space between roles, tasks, identities, and instead of filling that space immediately, I let it exist. That was uncomfortable, but it was also clarifying. I began to see that my emotional life wasn't asking to be managed. It was asking to be included. Food had been filling in for inclusion. Once emotions had somewhere to go, somewhere other than my mouth food no longer had to carry that weight. This didn't make life smoother. It made it truer. There were moments when emotional solutions felt inadequate, when connection didn't resolve loneliness completely, when rest didn't erase exhaustion, when creativity didn't suddenly make life feel meaningful. But they address the right problem, and addressing the right problem matters more than immediate relief. I stopped asking food to fix feelings it was never meant to fix. And I stopped asking myself to bypass needs that deserved attention. Emotional problems don't require discipline. They require responsiveness. They require the willingness to pause long enough to hear what's being asked for, even when the answer isn't convenient or comfortable. Once I learned that, my relationship with food changed almost incidentally. Eating became simpler because it was no longer overloaded with responsibility. It didn't have to soothe everything. It didn't have to solve anything. It could just nourish. And I could respond to my emotional life directly, imperfectly, slowly, but honestly. That honesty didn't transform me into a better version of myself. It returned me to myself. And that return, quiet, unremarkable, deeply grounding, was the most sustainable solution I had ever found. I didn't stop emotional eating. I stopped abandoning myself. I want to be honest about the ending, because it isn't neat. I didn't reach a point where emotional eating disappeared from my life. There was no finish line, no moment where I could say, this is behind me now. I still eat when I'm tired sometimes. I still reach for comfort on days that feel heavier than I expected. I still have moments where food is easier than feeling. What changed wasn't the behavior. What changed was what I did to myself when it happened. For most of my life, the real damage wasn't the eating. It was the way I disappeared afterward, the way I checked out emotionally, the way I turned away from myself in quiet disgust or disappointment, the way I treated my own inner life like something inconvenient that needed to be managed or corrected. That was abandonment. It didn't look dramatic. It didn't feel like self-hatred in the way we usually imagine it. It looked like moving on too quickly, like minimizing what I felt, like telling myself it wasn't a big deal, like numbing instead of listening, like being present for everyone else while quietly stepping away from myself. Emotional eating was just one place where that abandonment showed up. When I stopped abandoning myself, everything softened. Not because life became easier, but because I stopped turning every imperfection into a personal failure. There's a particular kind of relief that comes when you no longer need to punish yourself to prove that you're aware, when you don't have to fix, justify, or explain every moment of humanity. I learned how to stay with the discomfort instead of rushing past it. Stay with the confusion instead of filling it immediately. Stay with myself even when I didn't like what I was feeling. That staying changed the meaning of everything. When I ate emotionally and stayed present, the experience was different. It didn't spiral. It didn't turn into a story about who I was or what I lacked. It was just information. I could say, something was hard today, without needing to attach a verdict. I could notice the urge to numb without needing to shame it away. I could feel the pull toward food and still ask myself what I needed, even if I didn't always act on the answer. That's the part people don't talk about. Healing doesn't always mean doing something different. Sometimes it means doing the same thing, but without violence toward yourself. The biggest shift was realizing that my worth was never tied to how well I managed my emotions. I didn't need to earn self-respect by being regulated, composed, or disciplined. I didn't need to perform emotional maturity. I didn't need to demonstrate growth by being unaffected. I was allowed to be human without consequence. That permission changed my relationship with myself more than any strategy ever could. I stopped measuring my days by how well I avoided discomfort. I stopped seeing emotional neutrality as a goal. I stopped assuming that feeling off meant something had gone wrong. Some days still feel flat. Some days still feel heavy. Some days don't give me clarity or resolution or closure. But I don't disappear from those days anymore. I live inside them. And because I live inside them, I don't need to escape them as often. Food no longer has to rescue me from my own life. It no longer carries the weight of my unmet needs. It no longer serves as a bridge between me and myself. It's just food. And I'm just a person, learning how to stay present in a life that isn't always comfortable, clear, or satisfying. There is something deeply stabilizing about that simplicity. I think many women believe they're broken because they haven't arrived at some imagined state of emotional mastery. They think the goal is to be calm all the time, fulfilled all the time, regulated all the time. But that goal was never human. What we're really looking for isn't control. It's permission. Permission to feel without being fixed. Permission to struggle without being shamed. Permission to exist in the middle without rushing to an ending. I didn't stop emotional eating by becoming better. I stopped emotional eating by becoming kinder to myself in moments where I used to disappear. And that kindness wasn't loud, it wasn't affirming, it wasn't motivational, it was quiet. It sounded like, "Of course this is hard." It sounded like, "You don't need to solve this right now." It sounded like, "I'm still here." That voice changed everything. Because when you stop abandoning yourself, you stop looking for substitutes. You don't need food to hold you together when you're willing to hold yourself imperfectly, inconsistently, honestly. I still don't have all the answers. I don't think that's the point. What I have now is a relationship with myself that doesn't depend on performance. And that relationship is what steadies me when things feel unclear. So if you're listening to this and thinking, "I've tried everything and nothing sticks," I want you to consider something gently. Maybe the problem isn't that you haven't tried hard enough. Maybe the problem is that you've been trying to fix yourself instead of staying with yourself. You're not broken. You're not behind. You're not failing. You're just in the middle, and the middle isn't a problem to solve. It's a place to stand long enough to remember who you are without needing to escape yourself to get there. When I look back at the whole arc of this story, what stands out to me most is not the food, not the habits, not even the emotional eating itself. What stands out is how quietly I lost myself and how quietly I found my way back. Nothing about this journey was dramatic. There was no rock bottom, no crisis that forced change. I didn't wake up one day and decide to transform my life. I simply grew tired of living slightly removed from it, tired of managing myself instead of knowing myself. tired of smoothing over feelings that never quite went away. For years, I thought the issue was discipline, or motivation, or a lack of control. I believed that if I could just get my eating right, everything else would follow. But the truth was much simpler and much harder to accept. I wasn't eating because I was hungry. I was eating because I didn't know how to stay with myself when life felt flat, heavy, or quietly empty. The turning point wasn't when I stopped emotional eating. It was when I stopped treating my inner world like a problem to be solved. When I stopped judging my feelings. When I stopped trying to feel better at all costs. When I learned that discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong, it's often a sign that something is asking to be acknowledged. What I learned, slowly, is that emotions don't need to be fixed. They need to be felt safely. That food wasn't my enemy, it was a stand-in for needs I hadn't learned how to meet directly. And that the real harm was never the behavior itself, but the way I abandoned myself every time I felt human. The deeper lesson here isn't about food, it's about presence. When I stopped abandoning myself, when I stayed with discomfort instead of numbing it, when I responded to emotional needs with emotional solutions, when I allowed myself to feel without judgment, everything softened. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to change the texture of my life. For anyone listening who sees themselves in this story, the application isn't about changing your habits overnight. It's about changing how you relate to yourself in moments of discomfort. The next time you reach for something, food, distraction, busyness, pause gently and ask, what am I actually needing right now? Not to fix it, not to judge it, just to notice. You might discover you need rest, not stimulation. Connection, not comfort. Permission to feel, not pressure to improve. These aren't weaknesses, they're signals. And when you learn to listen to them, you don't need to escape yourself as often. This isn't about becoming better, it's about becoming more present. And presence is what brings us back to ourselves. You're not broken, you're just in the middle. Before we close, I want to ask you a small question, just to reflect, not to test you. Which one feels closer to your experience right now? I often try to fix my feelings as quickly as possible. I'm learning to sit with my feelings without rushing to change them. Comment A or B below. I read every comment, and your answers help shape what we talk about next. And if you feel comfortable, I'd love to hear more. What part of this story resonated with you most? What does emotional eating or emotional avoidance look like in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your perspective too. If this kind of quiet, honest conversation matters to you, please subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows me to keep creating content that doesn't rush to fix you, but stays with you right where you are. Thank you for being here.